We are live, and I know people are going to be filtering in from maybe the ends of their lunch breaks and whatnot, but we're going to let everyone start to pile in here. My name is Kate Powell. I am with the platform Kate for the People over on a bunch of social medias. And of course, I am joined by the amazing man who really doesn't need a whole lot of introductions because he is one of the preeminent Supreme Court/court scholars in the land, Stephen Vladeck, with at Georgetown and as a professor, and also just writes up the best Substack that you guys are obviously subscribing to one first. And if you're not subscribing, if you're one of my subscribers, like go subscribe to him like right now. It is worth it. But we are here to talk about the immigration detention bullshit, as I referred to it in the title on purpose, because the Fifth Circuit unfortunately handed down a monstrous opinion last week regarding this, that we need to vacate post haste. But also, this is something that is unfortunately a weakness of the code itself, and that we need to address. And especially as I talk about a lot on midterm priorities and whatnot, things that we need to be talking to our electeds/candidates right now so that they understand that day one of the 120th Congress in 2027, we expect this to be dealt with. So, Steve, do you want to introduce yourself real quick and then we'll roll through our agenda here?
Hi, I'm Steve. There we go. Do you want me to just dive in from the beginning?
Yes. So I'm going to run through kind of the lay of the land on detention right now, just so
Yep.
everyone understands where we are first. So the
Yep.
American Immigration Council unfortunately put out these numbers last week. Fortunately, they put them out. Unfortunately, they are terrible. The number of people held in ICE detention on any given day has increased by over 75% in the last year. The at-large arrests in American communities is increasing by 600%. The unprecedented deployment of federal law enforcement, as we have been seeing. Also, with the One Big Beautiful Bill, we now have operating funds to increase their detention capacity by 135,000 beds through the end of FY 2029. And just to put that in perspective for y'all, when the Japanese were interned, this is about the number. So we're talking about a massive detention, internment, whatever you want to call it, on the scale of something we haven't seen since World War II. And the main issue here is that these people, not only are they being detained for literally no reason sometimes, their legal avenues have now been shut off to them, at least when it comes to a couple of states in particular, but also just the way that they're having to seek relief is also, no matter where they are, is pretty terrible right now. So Steve, please.
Okay. Thanks, Kate, and I really appreciate the chance to talk with you about all this stuff. I think it's going to help for purposes of this conversation to get folks used to thinking about immigration arrest and immigration detention as two different things. There are, depending on how you count, there are somewhere north of 11 or 12 million people in the United States at last count who are subject, at least in theory, to removal, who are not currently in a lawful immigration status and have no protection from being removed. It is legally possible to arrest just about all of them, right? The reason why, going all the way back to 1996, when Congress radically overhauled these laws, no president has tried to do that, including George W. Bush, including President Donald Trump during his first term, is because of something called bond. Not James Bond, but immigration bond. Sorry, I couldn't resist. I had a Daniel Craig moment. Immigration bond is something that many, but not all, immigration arrestees are allowed to apply for, which is you've been arrested. You go before a judge and say, hey, judge, I don't have the kind of track record that suggests that I pose a threat to my society. I don't have felonies on my history. I haven't been convicted of serious crimes. I don't pose a threat to myself or to others. And, if you can make that showing to a judge, you are entitled to release on bond for the duration of your removal proceeding. That is why, Kate, right? Like, administrations have not made it a priority to arrest those folks because it would just be a revolving door. You'd arrest them and they'd walk right out. And that just is I think no president would think that wasn't a waste of resources. The problem starts in 1996 when Congress creates a new category of immigrants who are not allowed to pursue bond once they are arrested. And this is all known as mandatory detention. And as it sounds, like as the description suggests, these folks, once arrested, must be detained and are not eligible for bond. Now, the statute, I mean, the 1996 immigration statutes are legendary for being impenetrably dense and not well written. But the basic distinction that the statute draws is between those who are applying for admission, basically folks who have arrived at the border and are seeking to enter the country in some lawful way, and those who are in the United States at the time of their arrest. And the structural distinction there is if you are an arriving alien, you're subject to mandatory detention. But if you're already here, unless you fall into one of these very specific subcategories, unless you've been convicted of an aggravated felony, unless you have done other bad stuff, right? You are entitled to bond. That was the law for 29 years. It was the law across multiple administrations. It was the law that the courts understood it to be. Last July, the acting director of ICE, Todd Lyons, put out this memo that says, oh, no, 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 no. If you are out of status for whatever reason, and if you have never applied for admission before, you are an arriving alien. Even if you've been living in the United States for 60 years, even if you've never committed a crime, including by perhaps being here, it is not unlawful to be present without status. It's only unlawful to enter without permission, right? And so, Kate, the memo basically says anyone other than a very small handful of undocumented immigrants who applied for something and were denied, anybody else is subject to mandatory detention.
Mm-hmm.
It was not long after that memo that we saw all of the ICE surges start in Los Angeles, in Portland, in Chicago, and most recently in the Twin Cities. That's not a coincidence because with the claimed authority to not just arrest but detain all of these folks, now it became worth it from the government's perspective to go out and arrest all these people. And just to drive home, Kate, one more thing before I shut up, right? I can't underscore the point more clearly that the folks who are directly affected by this policy shift are the folks who would have been eligible for bond and now aren't, meaning not the criminal, violent gang member criminals that the Trump administration claims this policy is about, but everybody else, the kids, the grandparents, the law-abiding non-citizens. I mean, you don't need this policy for the bad guys, right? You need this policy for everybody else. All right. One last point about how we got here. Because of another provision in the 1996 immigration laws, these, how do I say, these cases could not be brought as like a nationwide class action. And so unlike, for example, the birthright citizenship case, which is now back in the Supreme Court as a nationwide class action, where it's like a handful of people suing on behalf of everybody,
Right.
because of the 1996 immigration law, these cases had to be brought, Kate, individually.
Right.
And so starting last August, the federal courts have received just a deluge of habeas petitions from folks who are in immigration detention and who are claiming, in my view correctly, that they're eligible to be released on bond. Kyle Cheney from Politico and the University of Iowa Immigration Clinic have done yeoman work in tracking these cases. There have been more than 3,000 of them. And the overall majority, somewhere north of like 94% of the district courts have ruled for the detainees, have said the Trump administration's policy is wrong and have released these folks. This is part of the flood in Minnesota that led to Chief Judge Schiltz, right, getting really pissed off about ICE defiance.
Mm-hmm.
This is about the lawyer who lost her stuff in a
Yes.
hearing on. It's because she had 88 of these cases. Like, these are all related.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Kate, we had been sort of moving in this like awkward retail litigation mold toward this policy eventually getting blocked. But the government was really savvy. And so instead of appealing losses in like Boston or San Francisco or Seattle, they waited until they lost a case in Texas. And then they appealed two of the cases in Texas to the Fifth Circuit, the super conservative federal appeals court that sits in New Orleans, but it covers Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. And then Friday night, we got the Fifth Circuit panel ruling, which says, actually, this completely ridiculous, unprecedented interpretation that no one ever suggested for the first 30 years these statutes were on the books is totally right. Um, and now that's where we are.
Right. Okay, thank
That
you
was a
for
lot. Sorry.
it's fine. I'm glad we got the full kind of context. And so we kind of have two forces going on. One is the fact that you can't do these en masse by class, and we got rid of the nationwide injunction, so we don't have that either. And then which was is part of the way the law was written in 1996 was that everyone has to do it via habeas. And then you also have the issue of so that's like the jurisdiction stripping. And then we have the issue of an unfriendly court to democracy, usually the Fifth Circuit, is saying like actually it's totally fine the way the Trump administration is saying that everyone is subject to mandatory detention right now with zero bond hearing. So it's not even just mandatory detention, it's there's not even an option for a bond hearing for people in these states. I know you mentioned in some of your writings that the Trump administration is of course like got it. And now they're trying to move cases, venue shop as they will, to these three states now, so that they can use that friendly jurisdiction to their policies. Is that correct?
Yeah. So, let me add, so two, yes, just to put two more pieces of context. So the first is a very nerdy point about habeas cases, which is the Supreme Court says you have to file in the district in which you're detained, which means if you file after you've been moved to, say, Dilley Detention Center in Texas, or after you've been moved to one of the immigration detention facilities in Louisiana, you're filing in the Fifth Circuit, right? You're filing in a federal court in the Fifth Circuit. If you happen to file before, right, if you are arrested in Minneapolis and someone files on your behalf in Minneapolis before you're whisked out of Minneapolis, then you're there, right? Then, so this is part of why the lawyers are all losing their minds because there are tons of these cases. They have enormous stakes, and the volume is unprecedented. The second piece is, the sort of the fact, Kate, that we have this spread, right, where I think it's like 330 judges have ruled against this policy and like 17 have ruled for it. Um, it really drives home that like there's no, I mean, I don't want to say that the government's position is frivolous, but like every single good argument cuts the other way. First, the statute is at best ambiguous on this point. I don't think it's ambiguous. Second, the Fifth Circuit's suggestion that like this reading would render, or the sort of the old reading would render part of the statute surplusage. Their reading does too. I mean, Judge Douglas, who was the dissenting judge in the Fifth Circuit, actually walks in detail through why the majority is not just wrong, but why they're wrong, like, sort of unreasonably so. Um, it's not a coincidence that judges from across the ideological spectrum in the district courts have
Right.
almost unanimously ruled against this policy. And it's not just that they've done it, they've written these long opinions saying why. So,
Right.
you know, it just, there's a temptation on the part of folks who say, well, like, well, if one judge says it, it must be reasonable.
Hmm.
No, I mean, if 95% of the federal judges to decide this question have all answered it one way, that should tell us something.
Right.
Um,
It's across the ideological spectrum. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I
yep.
think you even said Judge Ho, who is in the fifth, it is he's in the Fifth Circuit. Fifth
So there
Circuit.
are two there this is that there are two different judges named Judge Ho. So one of the really good district court opinions is by Judge Dale Ho, who is a federal judge in Manhattan.
Okay, he's the good one, right? Because there's one in the fifth, and I was like,
But
how
no,
is it?
but I don't want to lose the point, Kate, which is like, you know, I don't love that we're at a place where it's like who appointed the judge tells us what, but it's not for nothing that you see remarkable diversity in the backgrounds of the judges who are ruling for the immigrants in these cases, right? Trump appointees, Bush appointees, Obama appointees, like everyone. Whereas the only judges who have sided with the Trump administration have been Trump appointees and a handful of like older Reagan and Bush appointees. I mean, like that doesn't prove anything, but I do think that I've never seen a scorecard quite like this, right? Where you had such a one-sided reflection on the sort of the legal issue. So and Kate, that's before we get to the morals of this, right? I mean, like
Right.
one would also think that if Congress really did intend to subject, you know, grandmas who've been in this country since they were two to mandatory detention, they might have said so. Right? They might be a little clearer about it. I mean, we live in a time where we're supposed to think that like Congress doesn't hide elephants in mouse holes. Um, this is an elephant.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for clarifying all of that. And Yeah. It's a bit difficult for me to even work through this subject matter. It's something that hits very close to home. As I mentioned, the Japanese internment. I had family who was interned in 1942 under Order 9066. Like, I remember when this was last done. And interestingly, as a bit of trivia for everybody, the Supreme Court cases against that detention action are actually they were not successful, according to case law, like Korematsu being the most famous one. They were never. It was never determined that what the FDR administration did was illegal. So we're unfortunately there again, and it would be nice if we got it right this time. So along those lines, um, you have a couple suggestions for court solutions right now, because obviously we need to deal with this legislatively, but that's not going to happen until next January at the earliest. So what are the potential possibilities for the lawyers who are representing the immigrants in these cases?
So let me add one half sort of step before I answer the question, because it's the right next question. So the Fifth Circuit, as we've mentioned, right, covers Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. What that means is that as of right now, if you're a federal district judge in Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, you have to follow this FACAPTA panel opinion. But if you're in any of the other 47 states, you don't. And so this is not, the Fifth Circuit did not set a nationwide rule, but given how many folks are already being detained in Texas and Louisiana, especially, and given how many folks are being moved there, obviously it's a big deal. So the question of what happens next, I think, Kate, actually really is two different questions, which is for the two particular men whose cases the Fifth Circuit heard, and then for the broader issue.
Mhm.
They won their habeas petitions. They were released by the district courts on bond, and they're still at large. They're at liberty, because for them, the Fifth Circuit decision doesn't take effect until something called the mandate issues, which is like the time for further review has expired. So they at least are fine for the moment. But the problem is that how do you get the precedent off the books so that in other cases district courts won't be bound by this?
Right.
And the two ways to do that, the fast way is actually something called rehearing en banc, which is to go before the full Fifth Circuit and ask the full Fifth Circuit to take up the case. The reason, Kate, why that's the fast way is a super nerdy legal point, which is in the Fifth Circuit, and not every circuit, but in the Fifth Circuit, um, the second the Court of Appeals agrees to rehear a case en banc before the full court, even if the hearing takes 18 months, the panel opinion's vacated. Right. And
So
so
it's not a precedent.
it would not be a
It
precedent
doesn't exist.
from the moment the full court agrees to rehear the case, even if 18 months from now they actually come back and say, well, actually, we kind of agree with that. So at least in the interim, it would wipe that ruling off the books, perhaps to buy time, again, Kate, as you say, for Congress. Um, the downside is it's the Fifth Circuit. And the Fifth Circuit is, the most conservative federal appeals court in the country. It is a common split on that court, Kate, not to have Democrats versus Republicans, but to have Trump judges versus Bush judges.
Right.
And so, there are 17 judges on that court. You would need 9 of them to vote for rehearing en banc. I can count to 6 or 7 pretty easily. The trick would be there are these 4 George W. Bush appointees on the Fifth Circuit who are not quite as radical on immigration as the Trump appointee. Well,
Yeah.
but I mean,
Yeah.
I think to some degree reflecting the president who appointed them. I mean, George W. Bush was not a radical righty on immigration,
Right.
right? Um, and I just don't know where they're going to be on this. I mean, so one sort of data point for us is 2 years ago, it was a couple of those George W. Bush appointees who actually blocked Texas's SB 4, this effort to create a state level deportation system in Texas.
Right.
So it's possible that there would be 9 votes, certainly at least, Kate, to rehear the case, even if
Understand.
I don't know that they're not in the merit. So I think that's the immediate pathway.
Okay.
I also think, I mean, anyone who sort of knows my work knows I'm pretty cynical about our current Supreme Court. Um, I think there are probably at least 5 votes on the Supreme Court for the dissenting view in the Fifth Circuit for what I think is the right answer here.
Right.
The problem there is that will take time,
Right.
right? That if you go to the Supreme Court, the panel opinion by the Fifth Circuit stays on the books until the Supreme Court rules. And
Unless they did an emergency
so
relief,
this
is
is
that
tricky.
not
I mean,
possible?
I'm about to
Right.
out nerd even myself, right? But
Okay.
so a stay, which is what you would do to pause the effects of a lower court ruling, a stay would protect these two guys, right? These two guys would not be able to be rearrested and redetained. if they got a stay. And that might be of value to them. I mean, I don't mean to diminish their individual cases, right? A stay doesn't wipe away the precedential effects of the panel decision.
Right.
And so, right, and so the if the goal is to make this ruling as unbinding as possible, as quickly as possible, I think en banc is clearly the right answer. I think at some point, one way or the other, the Supreme Court's going to have to answer this question if Congress doesn't.
Correct. Okay. Thank you. That is really helpful. And it's definitely, I talk about harm reduction a lot. And I feel like we're here at that question again of like what's going to do the most reducing of the blood, of the blood spill right now. And then what has to wait until later, which is it's heartbreaking to make these decisions. And I try to be sensitive to that, but also explain to people like that's where we are. And I did see a question in the comments that I want to refer to because I actually asked Steve this before we went live. But the DHS appropriations measure is not a measure upon which this code can be changed.
So,
They would have to put another bill as another piece of legislation as a rider to the rest of the appropriations
right,
package. They can't write it into the
right. So the problem is you can't usually do substantive reform through appropriations legislation. And even if you could say no funds appropriated in this bill can be used for blah blah blah, the problem is that ICE was already funded in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And so here we come back, Kate, to a distinction that I know you know about, but that I think is not always out there in the world, which is not funding DHS is not the same thing as not funding ICE. And so there are other things that I think can be and should be pursued as part of the DHS appropriations kerfuffle. Hard to see how you do this one.
Right. One thing that I, have on my list of demands for the DHS appropriations bill is reducing detention capacity as much as possible. But as I mentioned earlier, most of that detention capacity is being done through the big, beautiful bill, not through the appropriations. And so it's like we might be able to get, I don't know, 10,000 beds out of that, but it's not like, it's not a solution to 135,000. Okay, so moving on to the legislation itself. So let's just, if I have my whiteboard out, which I don't have right now, I would have like the flow chart of the things. Let's say we have an en banc, and let's say by some miracle they're like, we can't hear this until 2027, and it buys Congress time to actually, well, it buys us time to flip Congress, which would be obviously existential, but then gives them something to do in January of 2027. What changes need to happen in the code itself to really deal with this problem?
Yep.
And what are the other things? So basically what I'm saying is, what do we, the people, need to be saying to our candidates and incumbents running for re-election about like our demands for this when they sit down in the 120th Congress,
Yep.
in order to ensure that we don't come back here?
Yep. So I think the first thing to say is everyone should at least have a chance to make a bond request. Right. And you can write into the law all kinds of people who will lose their bond requests, right? Like you committed an aggravated felony, right? You committed a violent felony, committed fraud. I mean, folks have their own views about who should and shouldn't count, but like it should be a presumption of bond unless the burden should be on the government to show why these folks can't be released. Like that should be part one. Part two, the jurisdiction stripping provision has to go. Right? There's no obvious reason why you can't and shouldn't have class-wide relief against nationwide policies that change the conditions for immigration detention. It's like it is a uniquely anti-immigrant provision that we don't see much of anywhere else in the code. And it was all part of this 1996, Bill Clinton anti-immigrant, what can we make him sign in an election year mischief.
Right.
The third, and Kate, this is broader, and I think this is going to get a bit toward the conditions of detention, even for those who are in custody. Holy moly, is it long past time for there to be a cause of action for constitutional violations by ICE officers.
Thank you. Right. Bivens, right? Yeah.
I have written about this, more forests have been felled by the number of pages I've written on this, but like it is absolutely insane. It has been for a long time. It is now visibly clear why it's absolutely insane that there is no mechanism for those whose constitutional rights are violated by federal officers to sue either the officers or the government for damages. It's not true for local officers. It's not true for state officers. You can use what's called Section 1983 to sue them. it should be long past time that Congress says, "Oh, I guess the federal government can violate our rights too."
If
Um,
anyone can, it probably is the federal government.
and it's like it just people could have told themselves a story 5, 10 years ago about why these remedies were less important when it was the federal government. You can't tell that story anymore. And I say this, I'm a bit personally responsible. I mean, I argued the Bivens case in the Supreme Court, and that led to the Supreme Court saying no Bivens for a unlawful shooting by a border patrol officer across the U.S. Mexico border. So my fault. Um, but like this should not be a heavy lift politically. Like you're not changing what the substantive law is. You're saying if they break the law, they can be sued so that there's even a modicum of deterrence and accountability.
Right. And Bivens, just as a very quick recap for everyone, is it's a man actually named Bivens back in
71.
1971. Yeah,
Yep.
okay. 1971 sued the federal government based purely on constitutional grounds, which was kind of radical. He was like, the Constitution is the law of the land, and I don't need a statute to tell you that you violated my rights. And he won. It was against what we would call the DEA now. And for unlawful search and seizure. And so he basically was like, the Fourth Amendment, that's my rationale, and I'm suing you. And he won $15,000. And it was a black man living in Brooklyn. If I'm correct, he drafted the original suit without a lawyer. Like he went ahead and did it and eventually got a lawyer. But like this man was like, oh no, we're not gonna stand for this. He was amazing. And so that is the basis upon which for a while, federal agents could be held responsible for constitutional violations. And then, as you've mentioned in previous writings that are very, very good on this, it's been chipped away slowly, slowly, slowly by the increasingly conservative courts. And now we're left with like basically nothing
Yep.
by which to pursue that. So, um, amazing. So, people, your action items right now are to continue, first of all, with the appropriations bill. Obviously, there's a whole list, and I won't get into all the details right now. I have plenty of other content on and write ups, and I have the last 3 Substack articles have all the information about what we should be demanding from appropriations to barely stem this bleeding. We obviously can't do anything as a mass about the court situation that's going to have to play out as it is, but these lawyers have proven to be no limit soldiers. And so we wish them the best of luck. But in the meantime, we need to be talking about the getting rid of the jurisdiction stripping of not being able to bring mass action on behalf of immigrants in this country when it comes to violations, when it comes to detention policy, when it comes to whatever that should just be dealt with. And everyone should get a bond. We need to also be demanding that everyone gets a bond hearing, and that's just written into the legislation. The end, we're done. I once heard someone say you make policy for generalities, not exceptions. And unfortunately, this is like on its head. It's like the law is made for exceptions, not generalities, and it sucks. And we're living it.
Yeah,
So,
it also and just well, I mean, if we're doing a wish list, it may be time also to talk about getting immigration courts out of the executive branch.
oh my God, yes, please. There we go. Yes.
But I mean, but
Yeah,
there's a larger point here, which is, I know that there are folks who sort of take the view that this is tilting at windmills, right? And this is rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
right.
And I'll just say, I mean, like, I respect the hell out of the people who are doing community organizing and who are trying to sort of, get folks to protest, and that's great. Um, but I also think it is worth like not surrendering the battlefield when it comes to the law, because if we've learned nothing else about this administration, Kate, it's that for as little respect as it has for the rule of law, most of its actions, right, are designed to have at least the veneer of legality,
Yeah,
and are structured to account for what it believes are the relevant legal considerations. That doesn't suggest the law is irrelevant. That suggests that the law just needs to be clearer, um, and sort of provide less wiggle room to a nefarious administration. And so I don't deny for a second that the ultimate solution has to be political. But like, look at the last 12 and a half months. The courts have been directly involved in fighting a critical rearguard action. There are thousands of people who are currently free when they would otherwise be in immigration detention because of federal courts. And so to suggest that the courts have nothing to do here, to suggest that the
right,
lawyers are tilting at windmills, is to basically ignore that reality and how important it's been.
right.
And when the courts do mess up and when the courts actually make things worse, um, the answer is not to give up on the courts. The answer is to figure out how to appeal as quickly as possible and how to change the law if not.
Correct. And I did think of another action item for We the People if you're feeling like, what the hell can I do while we wait for the legal team to decide how to pursue and whatnot. There has been a lot of success across the country with local and state officials resisting ICE's purchases of buildings for detention. So they have this capacity with the dollars of the Big Beautiful Bill, but they also need a lot of cooperation to get to where they're trying to go. And they're, again, I'm in Virginia in a very, very red area of Hanover County, Virginia. The Board of Supervisors just had a very brief meeting. Well, it was a long meeting full of public comment, but they made a very brief decision at the very end saying, we're not going to be selling this to the federal government. Thank you so much. Everyone have a great night. And and that was where they left it. No screeds, no speeches. They were just like, yeah, we're done. And it was because it was clear to them that the county was revolting basically against it. So if you show up in force in every single place where there's a warehouse being purchased or whatever by ICE, the government, and usually it's for ICE at this point, then do that. And it's not a, oh, this is a blue area only thing. Like I said, this is a deeply Republican ruby red area, and it worked. And it's been working in other places as well. So if you're looking for something else, if we can't make the law do what we need to do right now, we can make it impossible for them to do what they're trying to do, just physically, make it unrealistic. Steve, do you have any final thoughts for everyone? I thank you for addressing the nihilism about the political system and the legal system. It's extremely hard to be in this reality of harm reduction, as I keep harping on. It's like, what we can do is what we can do. Those two men are free because of that petition, right? And that's not nothing. It's not enough. And that doesn't mean we just go to bed and oh, yay, we won something, but it is something. But do you have any other final thoughts about how we move on from here?
I mean, I think my last one, I think, is just a conversational one, Kate, which is, I think it is really important for folks who are watching this to go out and help educate others on how this one policy is responsible for so much of what we're seeing, right? So, what's going on in Minneapolis, what happened in Los Angeles, what happened in Chicago, what happened in Portland. This is all about ICE arresting people who historically it would not have arrested. And this is all about ICE claiming the power to detain people that legally, I don't believe, and the majority of courts to reach the question don't believe they have the power to detain. And so, I realize that these days, everything is drinking from a fire hose and it feels like there's a lot. This one's a biggie, not just because of the number of people we're talking about, Kate, but because of the ripple effects. There is just so much of the current mess in our federal courts and in immigration cases and with ICE on the streets that is because of the Trump administration's effort to turn every single undocumented immigrant, right, into someone who's subject to mandatory detention. And it's not just that is based on a increasingly clear lie, that these folks pose no harm, right? It's also that we are in the process really messing up a lot of our systems. The federal courts, I mean, the courts in Minneapolis have been inundated with these cases. The lawyer who very publicly self-immolated last week, right? It was because she had been assigned 88 of these habeas cases. I mean, these pieces are all connected. And I think that makes this issue only that much more urgent and helping folks understand the issue that much more imperative.
Yeah. Fantastic. Steve, I really appreciate your time today. And everyone, again, I'll be pushing out a write-up of this with the subsequent action items that we talked about and what you can do, as I try to do on my channel, is be as action-oriented as possible and give us the information we need in order to sound intelligent, especially to our electeds and state, local, and federal levels, because this is going to be an all-hands-on-deck thing. But Steve, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you for staying on top of the nonsense that is this court. I know you said it's like drinking from a fire hose. I mean, just the beat of the courts and the nonsense and the appellate courts and everything and the things that they come up with is enough in and of itself. So thank you for your work. If you do not already subscribe to Steve, I'm pretty sure most of you do. But if you do not already, One First Substack is the place to be. And we really appreciate people like Steve and other legal scholars who are keeping us on our toes, and we will eventually get through the horrors. Eventually, I promise. All right.
Thanks,
Everyone have
Kate.
a yeah, have a
Thank
great
you.
afternoon.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody. Bye.